Hello, and welcome to Part 9 of the Unsolved Mystery Mega Iceberg Explained. Tonight, we are set to finish the third layer of this huge iceberg. The cases are getting more and more obscure, which I love. So let's see what tonight's episode offers. Penn Station Sniper. So we start with one that has hardly any information online, outside of a couple of old archived newspaper articles, and it seems that maybe this was intentional, as this was a great embarrassment for the NYPD at the time. On April 28, 1983, 50-year-old Emily Lucchese was sitting against a wall in a barren second-floor room of a homeless shelter for women, when all of a sudden, a gunshot rang out, and the bullet would enter her hip. The woman survived, thankfully, and detectives went to question her. Unfortunately, she had not seen the man, since he was a sniper, so no description or clues about the man's identity could be gathered, although they did find a couple of other clues. For one, the shot had been fired from a second-floor setback that connected the buildings on that street. Secondly, was that setback provided access to an Amtrak power station, which from there could be taken to Track 1 at the southern area of Penn Station. This would prove key later on. Secondly, was the bullet that was recovered from the victim. It was a .25 caliber automatic, and at first they believed that it might have been tied back to a murder in 1981. However, the bullets did not match. About a month later, on May 18th, hotel fire watchman, 45-year-old Alvin Siegel, was struck in the hand while making his rounds, and survived. This shooting wouldn't be connected to the others, however, until the following year. 1 month later, on June 29th, artist Brant Kingman would be shot in the chest while talking on the telephone in his second-floor loft, near the same homeless shelter that Lucchese was shot at. Detectives were able to determine that the shooter had even fired from the same location that he used to shoot Lucchese, yet they still did not compare the bullet to the one that struck her, instead opting to again check against a murder that happened in 1981, which did not match. Another month later, on July 31st, a 55-year-old Mildred Cohen would be shot in the neck while sleeping in the same exact room where Lucchese was shot, and bizarrely enough, she had been standing just 5 feet from Lucchese on the day that she was shot. Investigators confirmed again that the gunfire had came from the same exact location, but this time though, they finally requested that the 3 bullets be compared to each other, which confirmed obviously that it was the same shooter, and the authorities would finally respond and start a close watch of the area, as well as interviewing hundreds of residents, yet they still did not disclose anything to the public. Regardless, by December 4th, the sniper would leave the area and start stalking Penn Station. First, a 38-year-old Amtrak car inspector, Arthur Stavely, would be shot in the face on the platform of Track 21 and miraculously survived. The bullet wouldn't be recovered though, but 10 feet away and 4 feet away below the platform, a matching .25 caliber bullet would be found in a wooden crosstie. This led to the belief that the suspect was a railroad employee or possibly even a homeless person who had fired the gun at the track on an earlier occasion trying to kill rats. A little over 2 weeks later, on December 20th, a 61-year-old Amtrak conductor, Thomas Grayson, was grazed above the eye by a bullet that was never found. And finally, on February 21st, the only death in this entire saga, Richard Russo, a 29-year-old Amtrak engineer, was shot in the head on a platform. The bullet was linked shortly after this, and inspectors also established that the man was shooting from a roof of an Amtrak power station. Finally, the authorities would notify the public, only after word leaked out to the press anyways, and they organized a task force. Investigators would run background checks on more than 43,000 people, tested over 1,500 handguns, visited 10 different states, and conducted 24-hour surveillance. They stated that he was an agile man, able to go up and down roofs quickly. The perpetrator would never be captured though. A lot of this is due to the incompetence and infighting of the police department at the time. Persian Princess. In October 2000, Pakistani authorities would be tipped off that a man named Ali Akbar had appeared on a videotape being circulated around, in which he claimed that he had a mummy for sale. The Pakistani police would go to question the man, and he would tell them that the mummy was located at the house of a tribal leader named Wali Muhammad Riki in Baluchistan. a province of Pakistan near the border of Afghanistan. Investigators would then go there to interview Riki, as both him and Akbar were now accused of violating the country's Antiquities Act, which carried a sentence of up to 10 years. Riki would tell the police he had received the mummy from an Iranian named Sharif Shah Baki, who found it after an earthquake near Quetta in Pakistan. The mummy was then put up for sale in the antiquities black market for an equivalent of about 20 million US dollars. A week later, Pakistani archaeologist Ahmad Hassan Dani inspected the mummy and announced that it dated back to 600 BC. It was wrapped just like the ancient Egyptian mummies and rested in a wooden coffin inside a stone sarcophagus. The coffin itself had been carved with a large Faravahar image. The mummy was atop a layer of wax and honey and was covered by a stone slab and golden crown in its brow. An inscription on the golden chest plate read, "I am the daughter of the great king Xerxes. I am Rodagoon." So this discovery would lead to an argument between the governments of Iran and Pakistan over who really owned the mummy. Iran claimed it was a member of a Persian royal family and demanded its return, whereas Pakistan claimed it belonged to them because it was found in Baluchistan. But not to be outdone, the Taliban of Afghanistan claimed that the mummy really belonged to them. But Pakistani officials would ignore their wishes and put the mummy in their own national museum. And you're probably thinking, this mystery is going to be about who this mummy really belonged to. But you would be wrong, because all of this arguing would be brought to the attention of American archaeologist Oscar White Muscarella, who remembered the previous year being shown photographs of a similar mummy, except it was shown to him by a middleman named Amanola Ricci, who was working on behalf of an antiquities dealer in Pakistan. He claimed that it was the daughter of Xerxes, based on a translation on the breastplate. The text also contained a passage from an inscription in western Iran. The dealer would send a piece of the coffin to be carbon dated. An analysis showed that the coffin was just 250 years old. Oscar suspected a forgery and severed contact. He also requested the FBI to inform Interpol. This brings us back to Asma Ibrahim, the curator of the National Museum of Pakistan. When she began to study the corpse, she realized that it was not as old as the coffin. She also seen signs of decomposition fungus on the face, which is a sign of a recently decomposed body. Secondly, the mat under the body was only 5 years old. The story would begin to unravel, as the inscriptions of the breastplate were found not to be in proper grammatical Persian. Also, the tendons had not decayed like they should have. By April the following year, Ibrahim stated that the Persian princess was really a deceased woman around 21 to 25 years old, who had died around 1996, possibly by a blunt instrument to the lower back, such as being hit by a car. Her teeth had been removed, and her body was filled with powder. To this day, no one knows who that woman is. Authorities also don't know if she was a murder victim, or is possibly just dug up by grave robbers and sold to the scammers. From what I could find, investigators did end up arresting Ali Akbar and one other, but I can't find out whatever happened to them. Peter Bergmann. On June 12, 2009, a man boarded a bus in Derry, Ireland around 2:30 to 4 p.m. local time and headed for Sligo, carrying a black shoulder bag and standard luggage. He would arrive at the Sligo bus station at 6:28, where he then took a taxi to a local hotel. It was here that he would pay in cash and checked in under the name of Peter Bergmann. He was of slender build, about 5'10", short gray hair, blue eyes, and a tan complexion. He was most likely in his late 50s or early 60s. He spoke English, but with a German accent. He was clean-shaven and neatly groomed. He was also well-dressed, and many assumed he must be some type of professional worker. The man was also a frequent smoker, and was observed on surveillance smoking outside often. 3 days later, on the 15th, the man checked out of the hotel at around 1 p.m. and handed in his key. He left with his black shoulder bag, a purple plastic bag, and a different black luggage bag than the one he came in with. He walked over to a shopping center where he waited for several minutes. He then left and went to a bus station carrying all 3 bags, ordered a cappuccino and sandwich. While eating, he looked at pieces of paper in his pocket. After reading them, he tore them in half and threw them away. He then got on the bus and departed at 2:20 p.m. He was later seen by 16 different witnesses walking on a beach. The following morning, however, a father and son would find the man's body lying on the beach at 6:45 in the morning. He was wearing purple striped Speedo top swimming trunks with his underpants over the top and t-shirt tucked into them. They called the police, and the man was pronounced dead at the scene. Suicide by drowning. And here's where the mystery begins, because we don't know who this man is. As Peter Bergmann was just an alias, the man carried no wallet, money, or form of identification. They would eventually be able to trace the man back to the hotel. It was here that they discovered during his stay he had a purple plastic bag with some items or personal effects in it. He would eventually take a long walk from the hotel and came back without the bag. It's assumed he disposed of whatever was in it and put the bag into his pocket. Most notably, the man used garbage bins that were in blind spots of cameras, so detectives were not able to find whatever he threw away. They assumed most likely he was getting rid of anything that could identify him. It was also discovered that on the day before, he had purchased 8 stamps and 2 airmail stickers, which were used but to whom is unknown, and then left the hotel between 11 and 12 and asked a taxi driver for recommendations at a nice quiet beach where he could swim. He would use the same taxi later to return to the hotel that night. It's thought that the man was just looking for a secluded place on the beach to commit suicide the following day. An autopsy discovered the man was in very poor health and was in the advanced stages of prostate cancer and bone tumors. He had also suffered a heart attack in the past. The medical examiner noted that due to his health, he would have been in significant pain and would have needed prescription pain medicine, or at the least, over-the-counter pain relievers. Yet the toxicology report showed no medication in his system. There's also some confusion over his death, as it was listed as suicide by drowning, brought on by heart attack. So did the man just swim until he wore himself out and had a heart attack? Or did he take some kind of poison that caused a heart attack and was undetected on the autopsy? That part is a little weird. Regardless, the medical examiner concluded he would have only lived about 2 more weeks anyways, and his identity still hasn't been uncovered, as no one claimed to have known him. The home address he listed didn't exist either. As to why he hid it, theories range from Bergmann being a spy to a wanted criminal. Some even speculate he was the child of a Nazi officer, in which he was ashamed of, and decided to hide it. Phantom Sub. The USS Willard Keith was one of the many United States Navy destroyers sent to patrol the Pacific coast in World War II, and like the majority of these ships, they saw very little action. This ship in particular was mainly used as a training ship for engineering personnel and made weekly trips from San Francisco to San Clemente Island and back. However, on March 21st, 1945, the ship was sailing near San Francisco when a general quarters alarm sounded that an enemy sub was below them. Seaman First Class Chet Gardner had the duty of setting the depth of the explosive charges. After he set the depths, the charges were dropped and hit the submarine. A tremendous explosion occurred, and the team noticed an oil slick rise from where the submarine had been hit, but when they checked the sonar, they could not pick up the sub. The sub was believed to have been Japanese at first, but many of the men on the board were skeptical about that, as Japan was not in shape to send a sub this late in the war. The men would go talk to a junior officer about it, who dismissed their fears, but the men of that ship would begin to talk, and for years after the war, they would speculate that they had accidentally sunk a US sub. Their fears only worsened when Bill Anderson, one of the men aboard the ship, requested the deck log and war diary. When he received the items, he was shocked to see that there was no record of ever encountering a sub, let alone sinking one. In fact, there were no records that a submarine had ever been sunk off the coast of California. Over time, several divers have also commented that they have seen what they believe is a submarine on the ocean floor off the coast of San Mateo. To this day, it has never been found, if it even exists. There is no documentation of it, and we're left with only the eyewitness accounts. And if it is real, we don't even know if it was Japanese, German, or even friendly fire that sunk an American sub. Poe Toaster. Edgar Allan Poe, whom we have already covered on this iceberg once, died on October 7th, 1849. under mysterious circumstances. And close to 100 years later, in 1949, in the early morning hours of January 19th, Poe's birthday, a black-clad figure carrying a silver-tipped cane, face obscured by scarf or hood, entered the Westminster Hall and Burying Ground in Baltimore. At the side of Poe's grave, he would pour a glass of cognac and raise a toast. He then arranged 3 red roses on the monument in a distinct configuration and departed, leaving the unfinished bottle of cognac. The roses were believed to represent Poe, his wife Virginia, and his mother-in-law. I should also note here, we're not sure about the exact year this started, as some accounts state the tradition started in the 1930s, but it was for sure going on by 1949. On several occasions, the toaster would leave a note. Some were simple expressions of devotion, like, "Edgar, I haven't forgotten you." Although in 1993, he did leave a message saying the torch will be passed, and by 1999, a note announced the tradition had passed on to his son, as the original toaster had died, and this new toaster did not take the tradition seriously, and in fact, he quit just a few years into doing it. It was recently restarted in 2015 by the Maryland Historical Society, but the question remains, just who was the original? Well, this is one we'll probably never know the answer to, unless the second Poe toaster tells us who was behind it. Pope Joan, Joannes Anglicus, or better known as Pope Joan, or the name she went by, Pope John VIII, is the story of a woman that allegedly reigned as Pope for 2 years in the Middle Ages. The story first comes into prominence in the 13th century, and although it's mostly been discredited by modern scholars, some still believe the story is based on a historical fact. According to most versions of this story, Pope Joan was a very talented and intelligent woman who disguised herself as a man, and it's often said she did this at the behest of a lover, and entered the church, and because of her abilities, she rose through the church hierarchy and was eventually elected Pope. The story from here, though, kinda goes off the rails of believability, because it's said that during a procession, she ends up giving birth, stunning everyone and revealing her true sex. And then depending on which version you believe, she either dies after childbirth or is murdered. Another states that she did not die immediately, but was confined to a convent and lived in penance, and her son would go on to become a bishop. The church then removed her from all the official list of popes. The first official mention of her is around 1250, when Jean de Malley's Chronicle of Metz was written. He states that the events occurred in 1099. His story varies some, as it says that she was actually exposed after she went into labor while trying to mount a horse, and that she was immediately bound by the feet to the horse's tail and dragged and stoned and was buried on the spot. However, the most popular retelling of this story is Martin of Opava's Chronicon Pontificum et Imperatorum, which came out later in the 13th century. He would state that she actually reigned in the 860s between Leo IV and Benedict III, and that she entered the church to follow a lover. He would state, quote, "It is claimed this John was a woman who as a girl had been led to Athens dressed in the clothes of a man by a certain lover of hers. There she became proficient in a diversity of branches of knowledge until she had no equal, and afterward in Rome she taught the liberal arts and had great masters among her students and audience. A high opinion of her life and learning arose in the city, and she was chosen for Pope. While Pope, however, she became pregnant by her companion," end quote. But now we get to the hilarious part of the story, to me at least. Some versions of this legend state that because Joan was able to pull this off, a new rule was instated, which said that the following popes had to be subjected to an examination to ensure they were male, which included sitting on a chair that contained a hole where a cardinal would then reach up and feel his testicles before saying, "Duus habet et bene pendentis," which translates to, "He has two and they dangle nicely." The archives do not record if the Pope enjoyed this or not, although, judging by his smile in this picture, I would imagine he did. It should also be noted, the chair's true purpose has been disputed. There were also other weird legends associated with Joan, such as, when it was revealed that she was a woman, it rained blood in Brescia for 3 days and nights, and in France, locusts with 6 wings and powerful teeth appeared, so numerous that it caused a great many people to die. There's many other stories about Joan, and as time went on, it seemed to get more and more embellished. and as previously mentioned, it's mostly discredited now. Although it was widely believed for centuries, there is an argument that if she did exist, it probably happened between 1086 and 1108, when there were a ton of antipopes, which is a person who tried to claim they were the Pope, in opposition to the legit Pope, leaving her with a reign that is not deemed legit in the papacy's history. Other theories have stated that she was a real person with some influence in the church, but not a Pope, while another claims she was the mistress of a Pope, and because of that, she had a lot of pull. So I leave it to you. Was Pope Joan real and was covered up, or just a tall tale that got added onto over time? Red Bull Racing's stolen trophies. On December 6th of 2014, CCTV footage in Milton Keynes, Buckinghamshire, England, would record a crazy scene as 4 men in hoods and balaclavas reversed the 4x4 through the glass window of the F1 Red Bull Racing factory, and then proceeded to steal 60 trophies from a nearby cabinet before fleeing. The 4 men, Danny Stevens, Paul Smith, Jason Eastwood, and Luke Cole, would all be captured afterwards, and would end up serving 2 to 7 years in prison. The men had actually committed over 40 burglaries and thefts across southern England for about half a year, and raked in close to €1 million, and caused over 300,000 worth of damage. But here's the mysterious part. What happened to the trophies they stole? 20 of these would be recovered in Horseshoe Lake, about 100 miles away, 10 days later, and many of those had been damaged, but over 40 still remain missing. The weird part in all this is the Red Bull team principal, Christian Horner, would state, quote, "Beyond the aggressive nature of this break-in, we are perplexed why anyone would take these trophies. The value to the team is, of course, extraordinarily high due to the sheer hard work and effort that went into winning each and every one, but their intrinsic value is low. They would be of little benefit to those outside of the team, and in addition to that, many of the trophies on display were replicas," end quote. So these thieves stole a bunch of trophies that were basically worthless, and they must have realized this, hence the reason to throw 20 of them into the lake. But that doesn't explain what happened to the other 40. Did they find some racing fanatic that would pay top dollar for these replicas? Or were these other trophies legit and worth way more, and Red Bull just isn't saying anything in hopes of seeing them returned? I find this one kinda bizarre, because it seems like maybe the guys that were going to prison would have been like, "Hey, I can tell you what we did with those," in exchange for a more lenient sentence. There are a couple of theories in this one. One is, they obviously didn't know they were replicas, and planned to melt the silver down and sell it. Another theory is, they had a collector that was going to buy them, but chickened out once the press was all over the story, and the authorities were turning up the heat. Robert Cooper. On May 25th, 2004, Okie Albert Kite Jr., whom his friends called Al, would not show up to his job at an engineering consulting firm in Denver, Colorado. Al, who was by all accounts a great guy and very responsible, was rarely late, and never missed without notifying his employer. When they couldn't get a hold of him for hours, they would call his emergency contact, which was his sister. She would in turn start calling him, but she couldn't get a hold of him either. After trying for hours, she would eventually give up and call the police to go do a welfare check. They would be dispatched to his home, and they would knock several times, but Al didn't answer. They eventually decided to go in and check on him, and what they found was disturbing. In the basement of the residence, Al had been bound, beaten, tortured, and stabbed by his own kitchen knives. The suspect then cleaned the crime scene and soaked the kitchen knives in bleach, and he also removed some items. He took Al's wallet and cell phone, although his cell phone would be discovered later in a payphone booth. The man would then hang around in the residence for a time, eating and taking a shower before leaving. The suspect would then exit and attempt to use Al's debit card at an ATM. He was caught on surveillance video wearing a ski mask and driving Al's truck, but later, Al's truck would be found near his home. Now the crazy part about this case, the primary suspect was a man who rented a room from Al prior to his murder. He gave Al completely fictional information about who he was, including the name Robert Cooper. Witnesses who did see the man before the murder claimed this individual would often turn his face away when someone, other than Al, tried to look at him. He went to exceedingly great lengths to hide his identity. Fortunately, He did leave some blood behind at the scene, and genetic genealogy has successfully identified some of his relatives as living in the Balkans. It's believed he could be associated with the Turkish Hezbollah due to his similarity in some of the torture techniques he was using. According to the people that seen him, he had curly brown or black hair, brown or hazel eyes, and a fair skin complexion. He also walked with a limp and used a cane and spoke with an Eastern European accent, possibly Romanian. Various other landlords in the area had been called by this man, who told them he was looking for a place to live. He even called Al's girlfriend. He used a burner phone too, that along with Al's, that would later be found at a homeless encampment. He was about 5'10" and 170 to 180 pounds, and in his 40s, although some witness accounts put him in his 20s, while some put him in his 50s. He claimed to be from the East Coast. Investigators think New Jersey in particular, and was working for Wells Fargo. His reason for killing Al is still a mystery, although it's thought he may have been trying to get some type of information from him. But the torture he dished out was above and beyond what he needed to do, which indicates this was probably a thrill kill for someone's personal enjoyment. And as mentioned, he met a few other landlords trying to rent from them, and with at least one of these meetings, the witness said that the man didn't have a limp and he didn't carry a cane, which means the whole thing was probably a put-on to make Al feel more at ease and to throw off witness accounts. In addition, one of the other residents claimed to have seen him walking in a nearby area without a cane, while another landlord let him take a tour of the home, and she said he made her nervous, and he asked about where all the windows in the home were located. I don't mind saying, this case has always bothered me. It's one I really hope gets resolved, and I hope, with genetic genealogy now being involved, we see a resolution soon. Ronald Hughes. In 1970, the infamous Manson family were finally set to go on trial, and Ronald Hughes was set to defend the key person in all of this, Charles Manson himself. Hughes also had something of a reputation, as he was known as the hippie lawyer because he kept a big bushy beard and had a great knowledge of the hippie subculture. He was kind of the perfect fit for Manson. However, this was his first case he ever tried. In fact, Hughes had actually failed the bar exam 3 times before finally passing it just before he met Manson. Now, I'm not sure if that fact played a role in this next part or not, but Manson would actually get rid of Hughes 2 weeks before the trial date and replaced him with Irving Kanarick. In a twist of fate, Hughes would then turn around and become Leslie Van Houten's attorney instead. She, being a key member of the Manson family, actually, some said she was a leader, was charged with the killing of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. Now that Hughes was defending Van Houten instead of Manson, well, this kind of threw a wrench into Manson's defense. See, Manson's strategy was to have his 3 fellow co-defendants, Leslie Van Houten, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel, all take full responsibility for the murders and claim that Manson wasn't involved, leaving the jury with no choice but to vote for acquittal. But Hughes wouldn't go for this. Instead, he refused to allow Van Houten to testify. He actually stated, quote, "I refuse to take part in any proceeding where I'm forced to push a client out the window," end quote. He would then claim that Van Houten was not acting by herself, but was completely controlled by Manson, partially due to the LSD she had been taking. This set Manson off, as this totally derailed his plan, and it's been alleged that Manson would tell Hughes, quote, "I don't want to see you in this courtroom again," end quote. And at first, that's kind of an empty quote, but something strange would happen after this, because Hughes would end up deciding to go on a camping trip while all of this was going on, with 2 neighbors, James Forsher and Lauren Elder, both who were 17 years old. Now Hughes, who I said was a bit of a character anyways, slept on a mattress in a garage at a friend's house, and he had no transportation either. So he would actually ride with James and Lauren to a remote area of Ventura County in the Sespe Hot Springs part of Los Padres National Forest. The 3 intended to spend the weekend there. However, a massive rainstorm would hit on the morning of their trip, and his 2 friends, James and Lauren, said, "Forget this, we're going home." But Hughes told them, "I want to stay here and finish my closing argument for the trial." So James and Lauren would decide to leave without him. However, their vehicle they were driving got stuck in the mud caused by the downpour, so the two hitchhiked back home. That weekend, the rainstorms worsened and caused flash floods, which led to the area being evacuated. And after a 10-day recess, the trial would start back, and Hughes failed to show up. Actually, he never came back, and Leslie Van Houten would be appointed a new attorney. Because of the heavy rains, searches for Hughes were also delayed. They would eventually start again, and authorities found Lauren's vehicle, still stuck in the mud, but no trace of Hughes. They did run across 3 campers that had been in the area around the time that Hughes was there. They would end up being questioned and confirmed they did see Hughes. They were then administered polygraphs in regards to his disappearance, and they all passed. Finally, about 4 months later, 2 fishermen would find a decomposed body wedged between 2 boulders in a gorge in Ventura County, about 7 miles from where Hughes was last seen. The body was nude and had been eaten by animals. One arm was completely missing. Dental records confirmed it was Hughes, but due to the decomposition, there was no exact cause of death. However, the sheriff did say he did not see a sign of foul play and believed the flash floods had gotten him and washed him into the rocks. But years later, Vincent Bugliosi, the lead prosecutor, in his book Helter Skelter, suspected Hughes was murdered by a Manson follower. He stated that one of the followers, named Sandra Good, had stated that Hughes's death was the first of the family's, quote, retaliation murders, end quote. There was also one other unnamed source that apparently told authorities the same thing, but no evidence was ever found, and we're left to wonder, was this a horrible accident that Manson took the opportunity to try and make people believe that he was behind it, or was Manson able to orchestrate another murder from behind bars? Sabrina Aisenberg. On November 24th, 1997, a woman named Marlene Eisenberg would wake up to every parent's worst nightmare. It would start at 6 a.m. as Marlene made her way into the kitchen. She noticed the laundry room door to the garage was open. Thinking it was odd, but not overly alarmed, she went to check on her 5-month-old daughter, Sabrina, and shockingly, Sabrina was missing from her crib. The authorities were called immediately. Upon arriving to the scene and talking to the Eisenbergs, they would learn that the two had left the garage door open overnight, which they occasionally did, while also leaving the laundry room door unlocked, which they just forgot. Investigation of the scene revealed an unidentified shoe print, along with a blonde hair in Sabrina's room, and unidentified fingerprints in the house that the Eisenbergs believed belonged to the kidnapper. Neighbors also told investigators that there had been several incidents involving possible attempted break-ins in homes with small children recently, as well as one neighbor that stated that his dog started barking at 1 a.m. in the morning of Sabrina's disappearance, and when he let the dog outside, he thought he heard a baby crying in the distance. And speaking of dogs, the Eisenbergs had a house dog that apparently did not bark at this intruder, which investigators found odd. Unfortunately for the Eisenbergs, the detectives ignored all these clues and instead focused on the parents. They would deny it, of course, but the FBI would take several items from the home, including the crib and the bedding. The Eisenbergs would then go to the media to plead for Sabrina's safe return, and for some reason, law enforcement found this suspicious. In addition was the video that showed the Eisenbergs smiling as they left their home, which struck people the wrong way, including the investigators. The Eisenbergs by this time were tired of the accusations and agreed to take a polygraph. Marlene would claim that the investigators told her that her results were inconclusive and that they expected that because she was crying. However, the sheriff's office stated that the results were not inconclusive, but they refused to release the results. The Eisenbergs would now hire a lawyer since they were being considered suspects. Although they would take polygraphs again in 2005 and claim that they passed, but police would not confirm that. And here's where things kinda end as far as things we know for sure. Law enforcement has declined to comment on any evidence, but they have stated that the Eisenbergs have not been very cooperative and that they can't rule them out yet, mainly because there was no sign of forced entry and no ransom demand, as well as the strange press conference where they were seen smiling. They were also suspicious of a video taken of Sabrina just a few days before she vanished. Some detectives felt that the baby had bruises on her face, as well as a patch of hair missing from her head. The Eisenbergs, for their part, have stuck to their belief that someone broke in and took Sabrina, By November of 1999, 2 years later, Steve and Marlene were both arrested and charged with conspiracy, lying to investigators, and giving false information about Sabrina's disappearance. Investigators had made secret recordings of the two's conversations and claimed Marlene said, quote, "The baby's dead and buried," end quote, while Steve said, quote, "I wish I hadn't harmed her," end quote. But when a judge actually listened to these, he would drop all the charges against them, claiming the prosecutor exaggerated the strength of the case, citing that the recorded conversations were so garbled that you couldn't make anything out of it. There's basically two theories in this one. The first being that someone desperate for a baby knew that the Aisenbergs sometimes left the garage door open and went in during the middle of the night and took Sabrina. The investigators then got tunnel vision and locked in on the parents and never pursued any other line of thought. Or the Aisenbergs are responsible. Sandown Clown. In May of 1973, two young children, Faye, who was 7 years old, and an unnamed boy of a similar age, would have one of the more bizarre encounters we have seen so far, as the two were vacationing with their family at Lake Common Sandown, a seaside town at the Isle of Wight, England. The two children were playing outside around 4 p.m. when they heard a weird wailing of an ambulance siren. The kids would go follow the sound. That noise would eventually end though, but the kids moved forward to where they last heard it. Eventually crossing a footbridge, they would then come across a bizarre being that can only be described as a clown robot. It had very white skin, like that of paper, and its face appeared to have been painted onto the surface of the head, with two blue triangles that were supposed to be the eyes, and a flat brown rectangle that was supposed to be the nose, and a mouth that had thin yellow lips shaped like an oval, and did not move when it spoke. Its hair hung down beneath a hat, and was sparse, frizzled, and in reddish-brown strands. It had two wooden antennae that stuck out from the side of its head. Its hands and feet possessed only 3 digits each, taken from the Bufora Journal of 1978. Quote, "He was nearly 7 feet tall and had no neck, for his head appeared to be wedged straight onto his shoulders. He wore a yellow, pointed hat, which interlocked with the red collar of a green tunic. A round black knob was affixed to the top of his hat, and wooden antennae were attached to either side. The face had triangular markings for eyes, a brown square of a nose, and motionless yellow lips. Other round markings were on his paper white cheeks, and a fringe of red hair fell onto his forehead. Wooden slats protruded from his sleeves and from below his white trousers." End quote. It carried a black knob microphone as well, which is what it spoke through. After it grabbed the mic, the strange wailing sound returned, and the kids ran away. The being realized that he scared the children and stopped the wailing and spoke to them. Quote,
"Hello, are you still there?"
End quote. The kids would go closer to talk to him, and they said he lived in a 2-story metallic hut or shack in a wooded area close to the lake. Its walls were papered with blue-green dial patterns and had metallic floors. It also contained wooden furniture and an electric heater. The clown being was shy, but friendly. It told the kids it was afraid of humans. It would not defend itself if it were attacked. It would only drink water from the stream after cleaning it. It also lived on wild berries, which it gathered. Reading again from the Bufora Journal. Quote, "Before eating a berry, he performed an odd conjuring trick. He placed the berry in his ear, thrust his head forward, and caused the berry to disappear and reappear at one of his odd eyes. Repeating the process, the berry traveled to his mouth. Possible explanation could be that he was wearing some kind of protective mask and analyzing the berry to check that it wasn't poisonous." End quote. The being would then tell the kids that his name was All Colors Sam. They would ask him if he was a ghost, and he said, quote, "Well, not really, but I am in an odd sort of way." End quote. The British UFO Research Association would actually investigate this, but they could not find a shack nearby, nor had workers near the site reported anything like this. This account has always been viewed as significant, as the children's story never changed, even up into adulthood. They were also surprised by the amount of details given. This is the one and only encounter with this bizarre being. Theories range on what it was. Some think it was a human wearing a costume and just playing around with the kids. Others claim that it was a fairy, ghost, or some type of paranormal being, while others claim a robot, alien, children's imagination, a cryptid, or just a straight up hoax. Sara Ann Wood. On August 18th, 1993, 12-year-old Sara Ann Wood would get on her bicycle after church in Sauquoit, New York, and made the ride back to her home. Her house was on Hackadam Road, and it was within a mile of the church. However, she failed to arrive home and was last seen at 2:30 p.m. and was within 4/10 of a mile from the residence. The authorities would be called and a search would be launched. Within a couple of hours, her bicycle was found leaning up against a tree, along with some poster board, a church songbook, and some 8x10 plastic transparencies, although some sources state that it was a coloring book and crayons. In either case, she had taken them from the church, and they were now discovered scattered in an area of bushes several hundred feet off the road, and she would never be seen again. But a year later, in 1994, a known child murderer named Lewis Lent Jr. confessed to abducting and murdering her. He made this confession while in custody in Massachusetts on another child-related crime. The Massachusetts authorities stated that they would not extradite him to New York to be interviewed in relation to the Woods disappearance until the trial in Massachusetts was over. He would then end up claiming he buried the body in the Adirondack Mountains. He would then draw a map of her burial location for the police. Extensive searches would then be carried out, but they found no remains. Lent would then admit that he lied and said that she was not really buried there, and supposedly he did not want to divulge where she really was because there was another unknown victim that he did not want to be found. He would end up being sentenced to life for the murder of 12-year-old Jimmy Bernardo, and afterwards took back everything he confessed to about Sara, admitting that he made the whole thing up. But he would be sentenced to 25 years for her abduction and murder, just for good measure anyways. The guy is a total scumbag, and is a suspect in a number of other child crimes as well. But her disappearance would be reopened in 2015. The investigators only said that they were following up on leads that had developed in the Lent case and were searching areas not searched before. So I'm not real sure if a new suspect emerged or if they were just searching new areas. Lent's lawyer, for his part, has claimed that Lent is mentally slow and has brain issues, while the prosecutor has disputed this. Some people think that Lent is responsible and is just refusing to tell anyone so he can have something to try and hold power over the parents, while others take the opposite view and state that Lent was not responsible but was just trying to get attention by claiming that he was. Sergeant Patrick Rust. On the night of March 15, 2007, in Watertown, New York, Sergeant Patrick Rust, who had just finished tours of Iraq and Afghanistan, would go out to dinner with roommate Robert Van Velsen. After eating, they would go to the mall, and at 7:50 p.m., Robert would decide to go to a tanning salon, and Patrick decided to walk on back to the apartment. As Patrick was walking home, he would actually encounter a fellow soldier named Dylan Russmeyer, which roommate Robert would tell investigators later on that he overheard Dylan and Patrick on a phone call earlier, but Dylan stated that it was purely coincidental that the two had ran into each other. Dylan was riding with another soldier named Scott Grant. The two would pick up Patrick and give him a ride back to his apartment. They stated that they dropped him off at around 8:10 p.m. and left. However, they didn't watch to make sure that he walked inside. But let's go back to his roommate Robert. He would come in at 8:30 p.m. and would tell investigators that Patrick wasn't there. This is where things get tricky, because that means that Patrick either left in those 20 minutes, or Dylan never dropped him off to begin with. However, between 9 and 9:30 p.m., Patrick would be spotted by several witnesses entering a bar called Clueless, the only gay club in town, although Patrick was not gay, and the club catered to all types. It's here that he would run into an old friend from school. Very little is known after this. It seems like the two men left at 1 a.m. and went separate ways, although they seemed to play phone tag over the next hour or so, making a few short phone calls to one another. Now this friend, who is also named Patrick Law, was the last person to officially see him alive. By 5 a.m. the next morning, when Patrick still had not arrived back to his apartment, Robert would claim to call him, although investigators would find out later on that he made no such call. He would also text the staff sergeant to report that Patrick wasn't going to be able to make it for the 7:30 formation, which, again, was odd. It was after this that Robert would actually try to get a hold of Patrick, which was over 2 hours later than what he told detectives. By that weekend, he was considered AWOL, and both the Army and local police were looking for him. It's here that Robert made another curious statement. When asked where he thought Patrick went, he replied, quote, "If I had $27,000 in the bank, I'd be in Canada if I wasn't already dead," end quote, which was really weird, since he alluded to both Patrick being dead and an account that Patrick had that held $27,000. The case would go cold after this, and the Army considered him AWOL. Patrick's family would hire a private detective that found a few interesting things. One, there were plenty of rumors that Patrick's roommate Robert was involved in drugs, specifically cocaine. He had also heard that Patrick had gotten into an argument with an ex-girlfriend or the ex-girlfriend's new boyfriend that same night. Several sightings of Patrick would happen over the next couple of weeks, and the investigators for both the military and local police sorta just wrote it off. But 6 months later, Patrick's body would be found by a farmer who was cutting hay in his field. The body was too decomposed to determine the cause of death, although they were able to eliminate stabbing or shooting. The date of his death was determined to have went back around to the last reported sightings of him. So what happened to Patrick? Well, there's actually a few theories. One is pretty obvious. He was way too drunk and succumbed to the elements. It was 18 degrees and he didn't even have a coat on. And the manager of the bar reported that when he left, he was very drunk. But there's also his roommate, whom he had only lived with for 1 day. In addition to Robert's early weird behavior, he also refused to work with investigators now. And then there's Dylan Russmeyer and Scott Grant, the ones who supposedly gave Patrick a ride home. Grant's ex-wife would eventually come forward and claim that on the night that Patrick disappeared, Scott would ask her to give him an alibi. But there's also the friend at the gay club that met with Patrick. He was the last person to officially see him, as well as the altercation with an alleged ex-girlfriend and her boyfriend. This case has so many possible endings that it's really hard to say exactly what happened. Sheepsquatch, also known as the White Thing, is an alleged woolly-haired cryptid reported across numerous counties in West Virginia, predominantly in the southwestern part of the state. The sightings surged in the mid-90s, taking place mostly in Boone County, but also Kanawha, Putnam, and Mason. It's described as being a quadruped, about the size of a bear, except it has entirely white wool-like fur. It has a long and pointed head similar to a dog, but with long saber-like teeth, and a single set of horns not much different than that of a young goat. It has paw-like hands, similar to that of a raccoon, but larger. While its tail is long and hairless like that of a possum, it reportedly smells like sulfur, and may be caused by a musk scent gland, similar to animals like skunks and weasels. It takes its name from the fact that it's been known to rip sheep and other farm animals apart. The earliest account I could find comes from July of 1929, when coal miner Frank Kozel was walking home from his shift one night and took a shortcut. He actually was passing through the woods on Morgan's Ridge, West Virginia, when he encountered a white-haired creature about the size of a large dog that pounced on him. He would swing at it with his lunchbox, but he missed. He would then run, but continued to be attacked, and the creature only stopped once he reached the outskirts of a cemetery. Remarkably, he suffered no injuries or marks from the attack. Then we jump ahead to 1994, when a Navy seaman claimed to have seen the cryptid in the forest. He said it came out of a brush line and then knelt to drink from the creek. It drank for a few minutes before it crossed and continued up through the woods to a nearby road. Later that year, 2 kids would claim to see the creature playing in their yard. Well, actually, they said it was a large white bear that stood up on its hind legs, making it over 6 feet tall. The beast was startled by the children and fled through the forest, breaking medium-sized limbs off the trees along the way. Cryptid believers state that the children really seen a sheepsquatch, pointing out that albino black bears are extremely rare. The next major sighting would be a little more harder to believe, I would say, as a couple driving through Boone County observed the white large cryptid sitting in the ditch next to a road. They stopped their car to look at it, and the creature charged the vehicle, and then they fled. And there's one difference here. This couple would note that the creature had 4 eyes, but perhaps the most frightening encounter came in 1999, when campers near a bonfire heard snorting and scuffling nearby in the dark. They assumed it was a bear, but they could not see for sure. The sheepsquatch suddenly charged out of the darkness at the campers, who then ran back into their nearby house. The cryptid would then stop at the tree line and let out a terrible scream before walking back into the woods. The next morning, the campers would report that their campsite had been torn up and described it, quote, like someone had tilled it up for gardening, end quote. The last official major sighting came in 2015 in Folks Run, Virginia, by 6 campers. One of them noticed a creature crouching at the top of a hill. When it stood up, it looked to be about 8 to 9 feet tall, and the other campers would be immediately alerted. It ran down the hill with them, but luckily, there was a river separating the two. The creature tried to find a way to cross, but gave up and just decided to wade through. Fortunately, the campers had gotten to safety, but reported that its chest looked like that of a dog that had just gotten out of the water. At about that time, the campers would report that they heard a gut-based screech about 2 miles from camp, and the creature looked up in shock and let out a whimper and ran in the opposite way. The campers would then pack up and leave immediately. A silver cat. From one cryptid to the next, except this one is way more odd. This cat was first reported by the frontiersmen that were exploring North America. They were known to live almost exclusively in the trees. They weigh near 300 pounds and have tasseled ears and possess horizontal slits in their red eyes, as opposed to vertical ones found in other cats. Its most distinguishing feature, though, is its tail. The tail is 11 feet long and has the strength of a boa constrictor. The tail ends in a bony club-like growth, which is spiked on one side, and the other side is smooth and hard. They are rumored to make their lairs in the highest parts of the tallest trees in the forest. They're also known as an ambush predator, and will wait in the lower branches of a tree, hanging upside down, watching until something tempting walks by. The cat will then knock its victim unconscious with the round hard side of the tail, before pulling it up by the spiked side of the tail. It is said that the male cat will beat the flat side of the tail against its chest like a drum during mating season. It was reported mostly by the lumberjacks of Wisconsin and Minnesota. Spix's macaw spotted in the wild. Spix's macaw, also known as the little blue macaw, was a parrot native to Brazil. It was first described in 1638 by a German naturalist, George Markgrave. It is named after another German naturalist, Johann Baptist von Spix, who collected a specimen in 1819. The parrot had a very narrow range in which it lived, and required a specialized habitat, and due to deforestation, the bird was very rare throughout the 20th century. By October of 2000, the last known macaw disappeared, and the bird was determined to be extinct. But on June 19, 2016, this bird reappeared. Well, maybe. The film was in poor quality, and so it was hard to tell for sure, but the bird's call was identified as the Spix macaw. It was also found that witnesses had spotted the parrot the day before as well. However, it's been speculated that the bird was released from captivity by a poacher and released due to fear of the authorities, because although it is allegedly extinct in the wild, the species is being maintained by several conservation organizations, and even though we don't know that's for sure where this one came from, it's nice to have a mystery with a happy ending for once, because Brazil reintroduced the macaw back into the wild in June of 2022, and the program is still going strong. Ship of Theseus. I haven't done one of these in a while, but I like the idea of this one. Ship of Theseus is a thought experiment about whether an object that had all of its original components replaced remains the same object. It comes from a legend about Theseus, the mythical Greek founder king of Athens. He was said to have rescued children from Athens after slaying the Minotaur, and then escaping by ship going to Delos. And each year, the Athenians commemorated this legend by taking that same ship on a pilgrimage. This would require several centuries of maintenance to keep the ship afloat, in which time the ship would have had every part replaced, begging the question, is it still the same ship as the original, or a completely new one? This has been a philosophical question since ancient times, but nowadays, it's mostly used in regards to a person's identity, as we are always changing too. Are you the same person you was a year ago? 5 years ago? And so on, and so on. Kinda like when Marcus Aurelius quoted his favorite poet, Heraclitus, when he said, quote, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it is not the same river, and he is not the same man," end quote. But I'll just ask you, is a ship that has had every part replaced still the same ship? Stanton Bones. On April 27, 1990, Deputy Agricultural Commissioner Joe Carl would be sent to Santa Cruz Island off the coast of California to search for any old pesticides to be removed and safely disposed of. The ranch on this island had once belonged to a wealthy California family who left it to their son, Dr. Cary Stanton. He would take over in 1957 and ran it until 1987 when he too passed away. And Dr. Stanton, well, he was an eccentric man in his own right. He never married and basically lived in solitude on the island, to which he owned 90% of. For the remainder of his life, he was known to be a very rigid man. He went to bed at the exact same time every day, woke up at the exact same time every day, ate at the same time every day. He meticulously labeled everything. So it must have surprised Joe Carl, the man sent to remove any pesticides from the island, when he was walking across the vast ranch and came across an old wooden seed shed, and in that shed, he found an unusual and tightly sealed copper box tucked away in a cabinet. And on this box, there was no labels. Joe would open the box and found what appeared to be cremated human remains. He would show the remains to Marla Daly, who had been Stanton's longtime personal assistant, and she had no idea where they had came from. Joe would contact the deputy coroner, who would search through the ashes and found a clothes fastener made from the 40s, several false teeth from the 50s, and a diamond-studded platinum ring that predated World War II. He also found nails, staples, and screws, which had most likely been from a coffin. The coroner would go on to state that what fragments he could find led him to believe the person had been an elderly woman that was cremated sometime in the 50s or 60s. The question was who? Was Cary hiding a dark secret? Investigators kinda doubted this, as Stanton was so uptight about labeling items, although I guess most people wouldn't label any of their possessions as murder victim remains. However, because of the metal nails, staples, and screws found, authorities were sure that foul play was not involved, because as mentioned, this was most likely from a coffin. It's also not known if Stanton even knew this woman. The remains would be buried with a cross and an unmarked grave, and her identity is still a mystery. There's not many theories about this one. The main one seems to be that one of the ranch workers at the island intended to bury her remains, and for whatever reason never did. Striped Jaguar. The striped jaguar, aka the striped tiger, is a cryptid that is alleged to live in the rainforest of Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. It is supposed to be the same size as a jaguar, around 5 feet long, but it has a tan-colored fur and white, tiger-like stripes. The head is also smaller than a jaguar's, but the fangs are still about the same size. And in a twist of irony, it is known to track hunters. The recently deceased cryptozoologist, Peter Hawking, actually acquired a skull in 1992 from a hunter that claimed he had shot a striped jaguar. It had several characteristics distinguishing it from a normal jaguar skull, but zoologists aren't convinced, instead saying it was nothing more than a regular jaguar, and that the unusual coat, color, and pattern came from a genetic anomaly that is well known to happen among wildcats. Susan Powell. On the morning of December 6th, 2009, Susan would take her 2 sons, Charles and Braden, of the Powell family, to attend church services, before coming back home and having a neighbor visit that evening around 5 p.m. After dinner, Susan, who said she felt ill, took a nap. This was the last time anyone outside the home had seen her. The following day, the 2 children would not be dropped off at daycare, so the daycare center became alerted when they could not get a hold of Susan and her husband/father of the children, Josh. This led to Josh's mother and sister going over to the Powell home to look for the family. When they got there, no one came to the door, and the 2 began to worry. That's when they would call the police. When law enforcement arrived, they could not make contact with anyone on the inside either. They would begin to fear that the family had become victims of carbon monoxide poisoning. They would break the door down and enter the home. Once inside, they found no one. The only thing that really stuck out was 2 box fans that were blowing on a wet spot on the couch. By this time, investigators would be notified that Susan had not made it to work. They would also find her purse, wallet, and ID at the home, while her cell phone would be found later in the family's only vehicle, which Josh had been using. And speaking of Josh, he, along with the boys, would finally show up around 5 p.m. He told investigators he had left shortly after midnight to take the boys camping in Sampson Springs in western Utah. and he had last seen Susan sleeping in bed, which was certainly odd, since that meant Josh had taken the boys camping in blizzard conditions after midnight and just before they were supposed to go to daycare. Talking to Josh's boss also revealed that he had not planned to take the day off. Of course, this all sounded pretty bad, but Josh was able to make it look worse by saying that he thought it was Sunday, not Monday. Shortly after this, Josh would lose his job and would have to move in with his father, Stephen, 2 brothers, and 1 sister. And then a website was launched looking for tips about Susan's disappearance. Anonymous posters would go on there to defend Josh and claim that Susan had ran off with another man to Brazil. It was later pretty much confirmed by investigators that the posts were made by Josh and his father, Stephen. And speaking of Stephen, he's a weirdo in his own right. Detectives would find that he was obsessed with his daughter-in-law, Susan, and law enforcement would find over 4,000 pictures of Susan on his computer that were taken without her knowledge. And lots of these were zoomed up pictures of certain body parts, or from a hidden camera in the bathroom. Also looking guilty was Josh's brother Michael, who had sold his Ford Taurus to a wrecking yard almost immediately after Susan vanished. Police would find the car, and a sniffer dog indicated a decomposing body had been in the trunk, yet DNA tests were inconclusive. Stephen would eventually be arrested after it was found that he had some very disturbing videos on his computer. After this, Josh's own sister would then point the finger at her brother as being the one responsible for Susan's disappearance, and this case would become pretty infamous because of what happened next. Josh would kill his 2 sons, Braden and Charles, with a hatchet before setting the home on fire and dying himself from smoke inhalation. The social worker was locked out and could only watch in horror. It's because of this, Susan's disappearance isn't really a mystery. Investigators have said they are convinced Josh killed her. The mystery is how and where are her remains, and to what extent did the family help. His brother Michael would become the focus of the investigation after Josh committed suicide, as it was believed he helped hide her body. Michael, too, would commit suicide before being arrested. Texarkana Moonlight Murders. On February 22, 1946, Jimmy Hollis, 25, and Mary Jean Larry, 19, would go park on a secluded lover's lane at about 11:45 p.m. after watching a movie. After 10 minutes, a man wearing a white cloth mask, which looked like a pillowcase with eyes cut out, would shine a flashlight in at Jimmy. Jimmy would tell the man, "You got the wrong person," to which the man said, quote, "I don't want to kill you, fellow, so do what I say," end quote. Jimmy and Mary were then ordered out of the car, and Jimmy was told to take his pants off. Once he did, the assailant would strike Jimmy in the head. He was struck so hard that his skull fractured. The man would then tell Mary to run, and she did, to a vacant car. However, the keys were not there, and Mary would turn to flee further, only to run into the same man, who asked her why she was running, to which she said he had told her to. This sick individual would then call her a liar and knock her down, and then sexually assaulted her with the barrel of the gun. He would then let her up, and she would flee again, this time to a nearby house, and called the police. This had taken place on the Texas side of Texarkana. The sheriff would ask Jimmy, who had to go to the hospital, and Mary for a description. Both agreed the man was about 6 foot tall and slim, but Mary believed it to be a white man, while Jimmy thought it was a light-skinned African American. A month later, on March 24th, Richard Griffin, 29, and his girlfriend, Polly Ann Moore, 17, would be found dead in Richard's car in a lover's lane. Richard was between the front seats on his knees, and Polly Ann was face down in the back seat. Then on April 14th, at around 1:30 a.m., Paul Martin, 17, would pick up Betty Jo Booker, 15, from a musical performance. Paul's body would be found at 6:30 the next morning, lying in the road. He had been shot 4 times. Betty would be found 5 hours later by a search party about 2 miles from Paul's body. Paul's car would then be found 3 miles away from Betty's body and 1.5 miles away from Paul, with the key still in it. Finally, on May 3rd, around 9 p.m., Virgil Starks, 37, and his 36-year-old wife, Katie, were at home on the Arkansas side of Texarkana. As Virgil sat in his armchair reading the newspaper, he would be shot in the back of the head twice from a window. Katie came from the other room and went to the phone to call the police. When she did, she was shot 2 times in the face from the same window. Crazily enough, she survived and ran to get a pistol from the other room. but she couldn't see because of the blood. She heard the killer at the back of the house, so she sprinted out the front door towards her neighbor's house, to whom she told Virgil was dead, and then she collapsed. She would actually end up surviving though, and would be questioned a few days later. The investigation would include detectives from the city, county, state, and federal levels. A reward of $10,000, about $150,000 in today's money, would eventually be offered for info leading to an arrest. It produced several false leads. Tons of men were detained and questioned. The unofficial motive was believed by detectives to be, quote, sex mania, end quote, as money was never stolen. By 1948, investigators would conclude that the last murder of Virgil Starks and the attempted murder of Katie weren't connected because the gun used was a .22, while all of the others were by a .32. And that's pretty much it. I mean, there were a ton of suspects, but none were ever taken to trial for it. The one that gets the most traction is Joel Sweeney, which is a very weird name. A 29-year-old car thief and counterfeiter. Upon being investigated for the thefts, detectives would interview his wife Peggy, who confessed in great detail that Sweeney was the Phantom Killer. However, she wasn't the most reliable witness, and investigators believed that was because she was afraid of incriminating herself or she was afraid of Sweeney. She also recanted her confession. Detectives did find a lot of circumstantial evidence, but not enough to convict. However, Sweeney was concerned enough about being charged and sentenced to death over the murders, so much so that he pled no contest to the habitual offender charge of car thefts, which put him away for life. Many considered this as an unofficial plea bargain. The television ghost. I know I haven't done one of these in a while either, but this one really piqued my interest. The television ghost was an extremely early television show that aired on the predecessor of what we now know as CBS. It premiered on August 17, 1931, and was considered to be the first dramatic television anthology ever made. There is absolutely zero footage of it out there, and will almost certainly never be recovered. The show was based on the idea of ghosts telling stories about how they were murdered. Each episode was a different story, but the ghost was always played by actor George Kelting, who just painted his face white and wrapped a sheet around himself. And I know that sounds pretty lame, but this production still actually looks kinda creepy. The show was actually closer to a radio show, because the video was only able to do a continuous shot of Kelton's head and shoulders as he talked, and because of the technology limitations, it had to be broadcasted live and was unable to be recorded, and the few people that owned a television would note that the screen was so dim that it was barely visible. It was also broadcasted on radio, and none of those recordings survive either. If not for a few newspaper clippings, we probably wouldn't know about it at all. The Younger Lady. This is the informal name given to a mummy that was discovered in 1898. Although we know she is the mother of a very famous pharaoh, King Tutankhamun, we have no recording of her name or anything about her, which is a little unusual, considering the Egyptians were pretty good about this sort of record keeping. We also don't know how she died. She has a large gaping wound on the left side of her mouth and cheek. For a long time, scholars thought that it had came from grave robbers, but recent studies has showed that it probably happened prior to her death and was responsible for her death. Some think it was accidental and could have been something like a chariot crash or a kick from a horse, but others think that she was murdered by an axe. But I think the reason that it is on this iceberg is the lack of a name, and because the fame of King Tut, people assume that we should know her identity, which is true. But one key thing to remember here, King Tut is only famous because his tomb was so well preserved, and the artifacts taken from there would travel across the world to be viewed by millions of people. As far as his actual reign as pharaoh goes, he was pretty forgettable. Up until the early 2000s, a lot of researchers believe the Younger Lady to be that of Nefertiti, who ruled along with her husband during the wealthiest period of ancient Egypt, but this was pretty much ruled out by DNA testing. We do know she was the daughter of a pharaoh, Amenhotep III, a full sister and probable wife to a second pharaoh, Akhenaten, and the mother to King Tut, but yet must not have been very prominent in her own lifetime, as she didn't even get a statue or even an inscription. Even items found in the tomb of King Tut doesn't mention his mother. This is in stark contrast to other pharaohs. This leaves most historians to believe that she was probably a minor wife or concubine to Akhenaten and then died or was murdered before Tutankhamun became king, which led to her obscurity. And although I love history, ancient Egypt is way outside my wheelhouse, so we'll move on. Unknown Great Train Robbers. At 6:50 p.m. on August 7th, 1963, the Travelling Post Office, which was a type of mail train used in Great Britain and Ireland, set off from Glasgow en route to London. It was scheduled to arrive at 4 a.m. The train had 12 carriages and carried 72 post office staff who sorted mail along the way. The second carriage on the train, behind the engine, was known as the High Value Packages Coach, which carried large amounts of money and registered mail, usually about €300,000 worth, but because the previous weekend had been a holiday weekend, the amount carried was between 2.5 to 3 million. By 1960, the post office recommended fitting these carriages with alarms, and that was implemented by 1961. However, the older carriages did not get alarms and were put in reserve use, and it just so happened that one of these older carriages was being used this day. As the driver come upon a signal light at Sears Crossing, Ledburn, he would notice the light was red, which it wasn't supposed to be. This was because the robbers had placed a glove over the green light, blocking its view, while using a battery to power the red light on. One of the other postal workers realized that the train was making an unexpected stop and went to call to find out what was going on, only to find out that the lines had been cut. It was then that he was overpowered by a gang of robbers, and after taking control of the crew, the thieves would decouple the engine and high values carriage and take the train about another half a mile up the track, where they then planned to unload the money. The robbers would then raid the high values package carriage and formed a human chain and began emptying the loot into a truck. They removed all but 8 of the 128 bags on board, and it took only 30 minutes. The gang then took minor roads out to a rundown farm about 30 miles away. It was there that they divided the loot into 16 shares, and each man walked away with about the equivalent of €150,000 in today's money. By listening to the police scanner, they realized law enforcement were using a dragnet tactic and would find the farm soon, so a plan was made to clean up and burn down the farm after the men left. However, the man who was paid to go back and burn it down basically just let it be, much to the ire of the other men. And when they discovered this, it was already too late. As detectives were swarming the area, the gang consisted of 17 men who all took a share. 15 of those were at the actual robbery, while 2 of them were key informants. All but 5 of them were captured. Out of these 5, only one of them was known. That is Danny Pembroke, who passed away in 2009 after never being captured, and was only identified in 2022 by DNA. And this gets to the heart of the mystery. Who were the other 4 unidentified men? The first was a key informant, an organizer, who the investigators labeled as Osterman. In 2014, one of the original robbers, Douglas Gordon Goody, claimed that a man named Patrick McKenna, a postal worker, that helped him from the inside, was Osterman. But detectives who had spent decades working the case claimed there was evidence that proved McKenna was innocent, and instead pointed to a man known in the underworld as Sammy Osterman, an armed robber and close friend of some of the other men. The second unknown man that escaped was the guy who uncoupled the high-value package carriage from the rest of the train, and he was believed to be a man named Henry Smith. His father would tell investigators he believed his son was involved, but for whatever reason, he was never arrested. The third unnamed man was basically just muscle, and detectives have no idea who he was, or if they did, they never released it. The last one was the oldest man of the crew. He was 67 years old and was set to take the place of the train driver and move it down the track. Yet, he had been retired for so long and was unfamiliar with this type of locomotive, so he would just go help the other men load the bags into the truck while they forced the driver to move the train. And to this day, these 4 men still remain officially unidentified. Virginia Park Serial Pooper. Oh man, seriously? I thought we were done with these. In August of 2016, at Fort Barnard Park in South Arlington, Virginia, a place where children are taken to play, Parents would come across a pile of poop hidden under some clothing, and it was thought that the weirdo behind this was intentionally hiding it in hopes that some unexpected victim would reach down to remove it and would get a nasty surprise. The Arlington County Police did step up patrols since kids played here, but the suspect that left Lincoln logs was never captured. Will-o'-the-Wisp. The will-o'-wisp is a type of ghost light that is seen by travelers at night, typically over swampland. It is known in English folklore to have misled travelers because of its resemblance to a flickering lamp or lantern, but it appears in numerous other cultures as well. Some of the famous ones in the US include the spook light of southwestern Missouri and northeastern Oklahoma, the Marfa lights of Texas, and the Paulding light of Michigan. Yet there are many more. It's also largely connected to the paranormal, as many people attribute it to ghosts, fairies, or some type of spirit. Yet, skeptics claim that the light is due to natural phenomena, such as the ever-famous swamp gas, that is used to excuse basically every type of paranormal activity. I mean, come on skeptics, at least come up with something new. All jokes aside, this was even mentioned, going as far back as 1596, in a book by theologian Ludwig Lavater. Quote, "Many times candles and small fires appear in the night, and seem to run up and down. Sometimes these fires go alone in the night season, and put such as see them, as they travel by night, in great fear. But these things, and many such like, have their natural causes. Natural philosophers write that thick exhalations arise out of the earth and are kindled, mines full of sulphur and brimstone. If the air enter unto it, as it lieth in the hose and veins of the earth, will kindle on fire and strive to get out." End quote. Although this has been dismissed by other scholars, such as American anthropologist John Owens, who in 1891 wrote, quote, "This is a name that is sometimes applied to the phenomenon perhaps more frequently called jack-o'-the-lantern or will-o'-the-wisp. It seems to be a ball of fire, varying in size from that of a candle flame to that of a man's head. It is generally observed in damp, marshy places, moving to and fro, but it has been known to stand perfectly still and send off scintillations. As you approach it, it will move on, keeping just beyond your reach. If you retire, it will follow you. That these fireballs do occur and that they will repeat your motion seems to be established, but no satisfactory explanation has yet been offered that I have heard. Those who are less superstitious say that it is the ignition of the gases rising from the marsh, but how a light produced from burning gas could have the form described and move as described, advancing as you advance, receding as you recede, and at other times remaining stationary without having any visible connection with the earth is not clear to me." End quote. Another theory proposed is that of foxfire, which is the bioluminescence created by some types of fungus on decaying wood, which tends to give a bluish-green glow. Strangely enough, fireflies have also been proposed. Also, the white plumage of barn owls, which really seems to be a reach to me. Yuba County 5. The Yuba County 5 were a group of 5 young men from Yuba City, California, who all had mild intellectual disabilities or psychiatric conditions, who attended a college basketball game on the night of February 24th, 1978. It consisted of Bill Sterling, 29, Jack Hewitt, 24, Ted Weiher, 32, Jack Madruga, 30, and Gary Mathias, 25. After the game, the group got into the car and drove a short distance to a market in downtown Chico and bought snacks with sodas and milk. This was shortly before 10. When they failed to return home that night, the parents would call authorities. A search would begin along the route that the men had taken, but no sign was found. But a few days later, a Plumas National Forest ranger told investigators he had seen the vehicle parked near the forest on the 25th, the day after the game. Inside the car, investigators found the empty wrappers, cartons, and cans they had purchased at the store, as well as a neatly folded map. But there was something strange here. The car was 70 miles off the route the men would have been traveling. Furthermore, why were they driving up a long and winding dirt road on a winter night deep into high elevation forest? Secondly, why did they abandon the car? I mean, it had become stuck in the snow, but not so deep that the group could not have pushed it out, and there was no mechanical issues with the car, as it ran after it was hot-wired and the tank still had gas in it. When they took the vehicle back for a more in-depth examination, they found that the undercarriage had no dents, gouges, or even mud scrapes. Whoever drove it had been particularly careful. After this, several sightings of the men would be reported all over the area, and while most of these were ruled out, 2 of them were not as easily dismissed. One was a man named Joseph Shans, who had drove to the area where he had a cabin and had also gotten stuck in the snow. In the process of trying to free it, he began to have a heart attack, so he got back in the car to keep warm and waited on help. While waiting, a car with its lights on and a group of people around it would pull up behind him. One of these he thought was a woman holding a baby. He called to them for help, to which they stopped talking and turned off their headlights. Later on, he saw flashlights, and again, he called out to them, and they too turned them off and left. The man would eventually get the strength to walk out on his own and get medical attention. He did tell police that due to his pain, he may have been delirious, and the doctor did confirm he was having a mild heart attack. The second report came from a woman who worked at a store about 30 miles away from where the car had been abandoned. She told deputies that 4 of the men had stopped by in a red pickup 2 days after the reported disappearance. She said 2 of the men were in a telephone booth while the others were inside and bought burritos, chocolate milk, and soft drinks. Police would say this was a credible sighting, and they took it very seriously. Finally, on June 4th, the decaying body of Ted Wyher was found in a trailer maintained by the Forest Service at a campsite about 20 miles from where the vehicle had been abandoned. Searches the next day would find the remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling on opposite sides of the road, about 11 miles from the vehicle. Both had died from hypothermia. 2 days later, Jack Hewitt's remains would be found, and he too died of hypothermia. Gary Matthias would never be found. As far as theories go, some think the men stopped to see a friend and took a wrong turn and put them on the mountain road and simply got lost. Others think that Matthias, who suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and was prone to violent outbursts, could be the reason the men abandoned the car. It's also possible a third party was involved. Zip Gun Bomber. On May 7th, 1982, at 4:10 p.m., 54-year-old Joan Betty Kipp was preparing to leave the state with her husband for Mother's Day. When opening the mail, she seen a cookbook. She assumed it was a gift for Mother's Day, and when she went to open it, she was hit by a booby trap type gun. Taken from the Times, quote, "The cookbook had been hollowed out to make space for a small battery and 3 stainless steel tubes. The tubes were positioned to hit something chest high or higher. That means vital organs. In each stainless tube was a bullet whose base had been removed, exposing the gunpowder. The filament of a light bulb was stuck into the gunpowder. The wires from the battery were connected to the filament, and when the gunpowder was sparked, the tubes served as gun barrels. In Joan Kipp's case, the lab cops were amazed that all 3 tubes discharged," end quote. When her husband Harold ran in, after hearing the explosion, Joan remained conscious and told him, quote, "Look what they did to me," end quote, and then telling her husband that there may be others. He would be over a decade before he would strike again. When on October 15th, 1993, retired sanitation worker Anthony Lenz and his wife were on vacation in Pennsylvania. When their children came to visit, they brought the mail along. One package had a medallion in it, and when Anthony opened it, he, along with his wife and granddaughter, were shot. Thankfully, no one was killed. About half a year later, on April 5th, 1994, 75-year-old Alice Caswell of Brooklyn was shot and critically injured by a bomb in a medallion box, similar to the one used in the Lanza attack. Over a year later, 18-year-old Queens resident Stephanie Gaffney, who was 8 months pregnant, would open a package that contained a book. When she opened it, she was struck by shrapnel from 3 bullets. She survived, although the doctors induced her labor, and she gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Finally, on June 20th, 1996, 77-year-old Richard Basile of Brooklyn would open a package that contained a videotape. This too would explode, and on this attack, no one was harmed. This 1996 attack was the last one, and the perpetrator was never captured. Detectives did have several suspects, but they weren't even sure if the victims were chosen randomly or specifically, the earliest suspect was the husband of Joan, Harold, but he was quickly ruled out. The investigator then moved on to Craig Kipp, who was Joan's own son. In fact, he would be charged with her murder 3 months later, when a handwriting analysis expert stated that the note sent with the booby trap cookbook was similar to his handwriting, as well as a package-sniffing dog detected his scent on the package. However, charges were dropped later because the evidence was so flimsy. Another suspect was a man named Stephen Wavra. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and spent most of his adult life behind bars for making bomb threats and possession of noxious liquids. He and an unnamed friend had been caught creating book devices similar to the ones that contained bombs, and as it turned out, Joan had been his high school guidance counselor. He and his friend also had connections with other victims. Stephen had also sent out a 200-page anti-government manifesto to several places. But Steve was in prison during the bombings, so detectives would theorize his unnamed friend was doing it at the behest of Steve. In fact, at every bombing, there was a pharmacy located nearby, and this unnamed friend of Steve, well, he was a customer at every one of these pharmacies. Over 200 persons of interest were interviewed, but no arrests were ever made. Curiously, Joan's husband would always hold the view that it was related to the school that Joan had worked at. And that is all of Part 9 of the Unsolved Mystery Mega Iceberg Explained. With this, we finish Layer 3. Thanks for listening.